Hello and welcome to Aspen Ideas. I'm Sasha Sagan and I'm so delighted to be joined today by award-winning New York Times journalist and author of 14 books about the wonders of science, Carl Zimmer. His newest book, which I happen to have right here, Life's Edge, The Search for What It Means to Be Alive, explores what could arguably be the deepest question. And so, hi, welcome.
Hey, good to see you, Sasha. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, first I have to ask, it's such a profound question because it seems like something so central to existence. What does it mean to be alive? But it's so gray and so undefined. And I'm curious, what led you to the topic and how did you get to the point where it became clear that it was not a black and white question?
Well, I've been writing about life, I guess you could say, for many years now. First at Discover Magazine, and then at places like the New York Times and National Geographic, and writing books as well, and just writing about all sorts of things, from dinosaurs to redwood trees to jellyfish, and it's been a blast. It's been wonderful. But every now and then you sort of stop and say, like, well, okay, what is it about all these things that sort of binds them together? What is this life? And it's kind of funny because, like, if you talk to a scientist who just studies dinosaurs and say, like, so what's your definition of life? They might kind of like back off, like, whoa, I just study dinosaurs. And the same thing if you talk to someone who studies redwoods. And if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that there are actually hundreds of proposed definitions of life, none of which have become the consensus. And really, like, anytime that some scientist comes up with a definition, other people are going to poke holes in it. And so that kind of led me to think, like, well, let me think about life like a mysterious kind of kingdom, like there's a strange territory. And there's sort of the middle of it where there are things like us that we're pretty confident are alive. And then you go out to this sort of borderland where you get to encounter really weird things where you're not even sure if they're alive or not. And, and this has been really one of the big quests of science to try to find that line between the living and the non-living.
Yeah, the question of the borderlands, and you describe it so beautifully in the book, this sort of area between life and death. Can you give some of the examples that you give in the book of these things that don't fit neatly into one category and the other, and sort of how we deal with tolerating the ambiguity of this kind of gray area?
Well, yeah, I mean, this can sometimes, this can be the kind of the topic of, late night conversations in dormitories, like, whoa, so do you think fire's alive, man? And that's a legit question, whether it's at midnight in a dorm or not. Because, if we say, like, well, life has these hallmarks, like, for example, life has to feed on some source. Well, fire, you could argue, feeds on oxygen and wood. And so how is that different than what's going on inside of ourselves? So people might say, like, okay, well, yeah, it has to feed, but then it also has to be able to reproduce. But does that mean that some person who doesn't have kids is not alive? Well, no. Okay, well, let me make another adjustment to that. And there are these. Then you get into features of our natural world which are incredibly important, like viruses, for example. The reason that you and I are talking on Zoom is thanks to a virus, which has been turning our world upside down.
Right.
But scientists don't agree if viruses are alive or not. They have some of the hallmarks in spades. Ability to evolve, absolutely. Just look at the variants of the coronavirus. Can they replicate? Sure thing. Your body, if you're infected with coronavirus, will make millions of copies in a day. But some people, like NASA, for example, really feel that it's important that life be something that's chemically self-sustaining, that it has a metabolism. Viruses don't have that. So what are they then? Are they half alive? Can you be half alive? We tend to think of it as an either or thing, but there are lots of things in this gray zone, and that really forces us to kind of think about, well, what is it that we're even talking about to begin with life?
Yeah, it's that ambiguity that's so beautifully written throughout the book, that it's, so much of science is tolerating the ambiguity and the gray area. And I'm sort of curious how it connects. I mean, so much of our fears as human beings have to do with this sort of in between of something that seems like it shouldn't be alive but is, or something that should be alive and isn't. I mean, it's a million scenes in horror movies and things like that. And I'm curious what you think it says about us, or what you've found that is so deeply ingrained in us, our desire to have these neatly drawn lines. And you talk about Mary Shelley in the book, and you talk about so many other ways in which these are the questions that really haunt us.
Yeah, it absolutely, you're absolutely right. And yeah, Mary Shelley is a wonderful example of how of using the art of literature to explore some of the puzzles that science in the 18th century was starting to bring up. If we were to be able to understand sort of the vital force that was at the center of life, as they believed, could we then create that? Could we bring lifeless matter to life? And so that's where Frankenstein comes from. And you mentioned horror movies, zombies. Why are zombies so frightening to us? Why are we so obsessed with things that are alive in some ways? They're moving around. If they see you, they run at you, which means they have some sort of agency with the way living things do, and yet they're dead. How are they dead? They don't look very healthy, but why is it that we think of them as dead? And I think that there. I mean, I write about this in the book, that I do think that there's something deep-seated about these things, because we have evolved to sense biology, so that we have circuits in our brains that let us recognize living things very quickly and instinctively. We don't have a definition of it, but we can tell that there's something alive that's moving around. So we feel it. And likewise, there are lots of animals that will recognize that fellow members of their species have died. There's something different. They treat them differently. And so, so there's we have these ways of recognizing something's alive or something's dead. And if something's in between, that's that sort of uncanny valley of life, as it were, where we're like, well, what is this? But the irony is that the natural world is full of things in that uncanny valley, things that kind of die, but then can come back. That happens with lots of different species. So, but we have a hard time dealing with that, I think, because of our brains. Yeah,
I mean, when you talk about hibernation, and you talk about talking about the way that other species recognize their death, that non-human primates that you write up is heartbreaking. It's beautiful, that the section on that. I'm curious, in terms of recognizing what's alive and not. I mean, it's kind of like you just know it when you see it. Is the experiment that you talk about, where it's just dots moving, but through their movement, can you talk a little bit about that section, and just to give an idea of how our brains absorb movement to mean life or not?
Yeah. So what's interesting there. So there are these psychological experiments that scientists have run, where let's say that you have a film of a person walking around. And so psychologists will say, okay, we'll just represent that person by a series of dots. If you just look at those dots, just a few dots, it doesn't take many to be like, oh, well, that's a person. Yeah, they're walking. I can see that, even though it's just a handful of dots that are moving around. And you can distinguish between those and just sort of a random collection of dots. It turns out that other animals do the same. So like chickens, if you show chickens sort of an outline of a moving chicken, just as dots, actually, like a chick will sort of like kind of like try to align itself to sort of walk along with the chicken. Whereas if you take the same dots and just move them in random motions, it just doesn't do anything. So that's just one example of how quickly we and other animals can extract signs of life. We're like, boom, that's something that's alive, and I need to interact with it as a living thing, which makes a lot of sense. If it's a predator, for example, or is it a member of your own species and you want to interact with it somehow? Like, these are quick, automatic responses. And the fact is that people can have brain injuries that prevent them from recognizing biological motion, or to even like classify things as living or non-living. There's even one condition called Cotard syndrome, where people themselves think that they are dead. Then they will explain to you at length how they died a year ago. They're just nothing but an empty husk, and so on. The fact that they can tell you about it doesn't enter into it. So that, I think that gives you a sense of we don't, ultimately, like, we don't know life sort of scientifically. We feel it from the inside, and I think that leads to some of our problems. But one thing that's fascinating then is when you then look at some experiments that scientists will do when they're trying to create life, because then it becomes very challenging when you're looking at something and you're saying, well, is that alive or not? So one example I give in the book is sort of an interesting parallel to those dots I mentioned. Lee Cronin at the University of Glasgow has basically built a robot that carries out chemical experiments 24 hours a day. And what he's doing is he's mixing together combinations of simple molecules that form droplets. And he finds that as you adjust them and try different combinations, you can create droplets that will float in a dish of water and start to move around together. Like, again, you look at it with your biologically inclined mind, you're like, they seem to be alive. They're moving around like in a little herd, or maybe they split in two, and you're like, oh my gosh, is it reproducing? Cronin isn't making really any judgments about it, but the fact that it's lifelike, he argues, is important, because there are these features of life that could have emerged on a lifeless Earth long before life as we know it. Chemistry has a lot of qualities of life in it that we don't even understand yet.
Right, and the life as we know it question is such an interesting part of this section on space exploration. And I have to say, you mentioned my dad, and the title of one of the chapters comes from a moment. But I'm curious what you learned and what your own assessment is of. We're just looking at this from the context of our particular planet. How wide do we have to cast the net when we look out into the universe?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. Yeah, and I mean, I should explain that for the audience, I should explain that the title of that chapter is "No Obvious Bushes," and so Sasha's dad, Carl Sagan, said that line back in the 70s when he was looking at the first footage from the Viking lander on Mars, and I found a video of him. It was ABC News was filming it, and I felt so bad for him, because like there he was, like hoping to see life, and he's like looking at this kind of pretty bare desert-like landscape, and he's kind of like, well, I see no obvious bushes, which, I mean, for such a magnificent writer as your dad, like that is a clear sign of real awkwardness. But what could he do? Like, there were no bushes on Mars. No one's found any bushes or Martians or anything yet. But I don't. A lot of it's interesting. I mean, a lot of scientists, almost 50 years later, are still hold open the possibility that there might be life on Mars, maybe deep underground. There are weird puffs of methane that come out of Mars that don't seem to be explained by anything other than life. So maybe. In Life's Edge, I also talk about places people may not be quite as familiar with. For example, the icy moons of Jupiter and Saturn. So they're covered in ice, and they have huge oceans, liquid oceans inside of them. And there's probably a lot of weird chemistry happening inside, underneath the ice. Could be that life began there. It could be that maybe life is in the process of forming in there. We won't know until we look under the ice, unfortunately. The other possibility would be to actually use telescopes, such as the big, powerful James Webb telescope that we're hoping is going to go into space soon, to look at other stars and the planets around the stars, because we can actually start to figure out what's in their atmospheres. There might be certain signatures, biosignatures, that you can see in an atmosphere of a planet that would tell you that there has to be life there. But it's not an easy thing, because there are lots of things other than life that can produce the same kind of chemistry. So again, that line between life and non-life, it's always driving scientists crazy, and will continue to do so.
Yeah, right. And I mean, and that's sort of, you know, one of the scientists you talk to in your book makes the argument that not defining it is a stronger position than having a definition, and that when we paint ourselves into a corner, essentially, with a definition, that puts on blinders. Can you talk a little bit about that idea, about how it's better to maybe not have a hard and fast set of criteria?
Yeah, so I think this was a conversation I had with Lori Barge, who is an astrobiologist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and she studies places like Mars, places like these icy moons, and she actually tries to recreate those frozen oceans in her lab. For example, it's possible that on the seafloor, on these moons like Enceladus, you might have giant chimneys might spontaneously form, and because there'll be this mineral-rich water shooting up from the core of these moons. And so, yeah, so like I'll say, like, okay, well, you know, you're an astrobiologist, like your whole job is about thinking and looking for life on other planets and moons. So what's your definition of life? And she just said, I prefer not to have one. Because it really, you know, to her, it really does kind of box you in, because, and it may have to more do with sort of the problem with definitions, just philosophically speaking.
Right.
You know, I mean, our definitions tend to be just looking at things around us that we just have agreed on that are alive, and saying, well, it has this, this, and this, and this. So does that mean that life has to have DNA? Does it have to use water as a solvent? I mean, are those part of the requirements of life? You know, that could just happen to be one experiment that turned out well on one planet, and maybe if you went to another planet or moon, it would have taken a completely different course. And nobody can tell you, like, well, what are the full range of possibilities of that can produce something that we'll call life, because we haven't found anything yet. Aside from Earth. And life on Earth is wonderful and diverse, and also incredibly boring, because it's all basically the same.
That's, yeah, it's true. I mean, we approach so much with such a, you know, earthocentric view of things. This seems to also be, you know, one of those questions that we have just very narrow data sample for the answer. While we're speaking of the diversity of life on Earth, one of my favorite things in the book was the slime molds and the interstate highway. Can you describe that, and maybe give us a little sense of what you think that sort of says about human ingenuity and creativity, and how we see ourselves?
Yeah. So in the book, I, you know, in addition to sort of grappling with these definitions of life, I also try to give some thought to, well, what is it that scientists think about in terms of what sometimes they call the hallmarks of life? That is, things about life that seem really distinctive, that seem to be special. And there are, you know, I single out a few of them, you know, metabolism, homeostasis, evolution. And then there's another one that, you know, I would call intelligence. And we tend to think of intelligence as like, oh, that's what you need to do the SATs right. But I'm talking more broadly about intelligence as a capacity to take in information about your environment, work on that information, and come up with a decision about what to do next, a decision that's going to benefit you, that's something better than random. And you don't actually need a brain to do that. And my favorite example of that intelligence you mentioned is slime molds. Now, I would bet most people are not aware of slime molds, but if you've ever gone for a walk in the woods, especially this time of year, you've probably seen one, and you said, "Oh, that's disgusting," because they're disgusting. I mean, they look like these sort of throbbing mounds of protoplasm, and they have these weird bright yellow or orange colors. They have names like dog vomit because that's what one species looks like. But they're really cool, and what's cool about them is that they are, they can be like this big, but it's one cell. It's not a fungi, it's not a mold really. It's actually basically like an amoeba, and it sends out tentacles in different directions. And when it follows chemical traces of food until it finds food. It likes to eat bacteria. And so scientists love slime molds too, because they can do these incredible experiments with them in the lab, because you can just take a little bit of slime mold and drop it in the middle of a petri dish, stick a little piece of oatmeal, which slime molds love, and it'll find the oatmeal. It'll just, and it'll go right to it. If you put 2 pieces of oatmeal there, it'll split and find them both and basically form a one long tube between them. 3, it will form a network, a very efficient network between the 3 of them. So scientists have said, like, wow, like how far does this go? And they found that in a sense, slime molds are like mathematicians, so they have put down bits of oatmeal to mimic like the Tokyo subway system, and just put the slime mold there, and the slime mold finds all the food and then pulls back all its tentacles except for the most efficient connection, which looks a lot like the actual Tokyo subway system. So again, like, we needed our brains to find these efficient solutions, but there's an intelligence to life that allows something like a slime mold to solve these problems as well, just over the course of a day. Slime molds were just a wonderful revelation while I was working on this book.
I really, I wasn't expecting to love that section as much as I did. It was fascinating. And yeah, I mean, it sort of begs the question of if it's, this, desire to survive, finding a way to survive is, one of the elements in all of this, because I mean, I just love the idea of putting the oatmeal in all the major cities. I think they also did the shape of the United States with the,
right. Yes, they also, another one did someone else did the cities in the United States on a little map of the United States. Yeah, and they actually, as you mentioned, it sort of ended up looking like the interstate system.
It's amazing. I love that. For our viewers, if you have a question, we're going to do questions in about 5 minutes, I think, and you can put them in the chat. Going back to Mary Shelley, and there's this poem by Erasmus Darwin that you have in the book, and there's this like kind of hilarious like song about radium, and there's all these sort of artistic musical elements, almost as a theme throughout the book, that seem like they're different ways we are, have tried to sort of wrap our mind around these deep questions. And I'm curious about the intersection of, scientific revelation and art, science fiction, even just pop culture, and what you found, and sort of the ways that we wrestle with these questions in both spheres.
Yeah, I mean, I love to be able to take on a subject like life from these different perspectives, because The fact is that these scientific subjects, they're not just limited to, a dry monograph in a scientific journal. That's obviously an important part of science, but science and the subject of science is bigger than that. And it's, just science happens in society. People do science, and they do it for all sorts of reasons, which are not always, purely rational. And they don't carry out their science in a purely rational way. Sometimes they do it for glory, and sometimes they act in, very ignoble ways. But that's okay. It's all part of that human drama. So so I have, there are poems in the book, as you mentioned. There's songs that physicists came up with. So there was this one physicist at Cambridge named John Butler Burke, who thought he had created life in the early 1900s by mixing radium with sterile beef broth. He thought he saw these things that looked like microbes, but were more primitive. So he called them radiobes, and claimed that this could have been how life itself began on Earth. And here he was recreating it. And so the physicists, he was the toast of Cambridge. They came up with this wonderful song for him. And he became incredibly famous. He was described as being, as famous as the most famous athletes of the time. He was headlines everywhere. And then some scientists discovered that everything he had done was wrong, that it was all a chemical artifact. And he refused to accept that. I mean, he had found the secret of life, and he wasn't going to back away from that. And so, it's quite poignant to follow John Butler Burke's life as best as I can. I found, letters, 10 years after this incredible apex of fame. There were letters he was writing to literary relief funds, begging for money because he had gone bankrupt, and was so ashamed, and continued to write just sort of books that were just sort of a hot mess, like books that just made no sense. If you try to read them, they were just gibberish. That's part of science too. The failures, the dead ends. I think it just goes to show just how hard it is to make sense of this borderland that we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. And science is it's being done by human beings, and that is reflected throughout the book so beautifully, in the triumphs and the failures. Before we get to the questions from the audience, my last question for you is, what astonished you in your research? As you set out to write this book, you must have had some idea, what you were going to cover. Was there anything you came upon that changed your own personal idea of what it means to be alive?
I really, it was really interesting talking with physicists. Physicists have a long history of barging into biology and saying, okay, we have this covered, people. You don't know what you're doing. We're going to fix things. So, biologists can be kind of suspicious of physicists. But Ernst Schrödinger, he wrote the massively influential book "What Is Life" in the 1940s, which gave rise to really modern molecular biology. And today, when you talk to physicists, what they're trying to do now is they're trying to create a theory of life, not a definition of life, but a theory. In the same way that a theory of chemistry lets you understand what water is, rather than trying to define water by its wet and its transparent, its characteristics, you create a theory about atoms, molecules, and so on, and then water just starts to make sense as molecules of H2O, but maybe other molecules as well. So life is hopefully going to be explained maybe in our own lifetime through a theory like this. In the same way superconductivity has a theory. People discovered superconductivity, this weird way that materials lost their resistance to current at cold temperatures, and no one could explain it. Einstein tried, couldn't do it. And then some other physicists came up with a theory that explained it. And then we kind of got a handle on superconductivity and could use that to learn more about it. So that was a really, for me, that was like the most, I think the most, the sort of the biggest shift in thinking about life and how to think about it. But, unfortunately, it's a theory that does not yet fully exist.
Right. Right. Well, that ambiguity again, that is just such a wonderful through line through all of this, and everyone's individual life also. Okay, now we'll go to some questions. Thank you so much to the audience and to Carl. Let me see here. Okay, I have them here. What difference will it make if we reach an agreed upon definition of life? Is it possible to create that kind of consensus? That's one.
Right. So, I mean, that's a great question, and I write in the book about philosophers such as a University of Colorado philosopher, not far from Aspen, who Carol Cleland, who argues that it is impossible to define life, and not only that, but it is harmful to try. You can define definitions. She argues are things that you use to organize your concepts. So a bachelor, by definition, is an unmarried man. What is marriage? What are men? Like, that's where things start to get really complicated. But bachelor is a particular concept that connects to other concepts. Life doesn't work like that. And so trying to define it is, I mentioned water before. You can actually find, like in the early 1500s, alchemists could define water for you. And again, they would do it by defining it by its characteristics. The water is transparent, it's liquid, it dissolves certain things, but that led them into all sorts of problems that the definitions couldn't help them with. So, it gets cold. What happened? And that water is no longer liquid. Is it still water? Well, no, it's not. If you're just going by these characteristics. There were kinds of water that could dissolve things and not other things. So now you have different kinds of water. Well, what does that mean? I mean, like, if this is one thing, then how can it be different things? And Leonardo da Vinci even complained about this. Like, water can be anything. What's going on? So what needs to happen instead is sort of open-ended experiments on all sorts of kinds of matter that can then lead scientists to a theory. It could be just making lots and lots of really careful measurements of the flow of molecules inside of cells, or information. In a way, our bodies are information processors. So they're actually, like, physicists have ways to measure the flow of information within cells, in our brains, and so on. Those measurements may help as well. So that's what, so what we really need to focus on is the quest for a theory of life. And there are a few that are in contention now. None of them have won the day yet.
It's very interesting. I think one of the things that's so fascinating is that it's such a current question that, as you said, we may get a definition or a theory rather in our lifetime. And the idea that, as days and weeks go by, there's maybe a fuller picture, but we're not there yet. We have some really good questions. Okay, this one, should you want to hazard a guess, what kind of life do you expect we will find when, I would say if, but when we meet extraterrestrial life? If you would like to take a shot.
I think we'll find microbes. I think there could be microbes under the crust in Mars. I think there could be microbes in Enceladus. I know that maybe that's not what people want to find. We want that sort of vaguely bipedal thing to walk off a spaceship and say, like, greetings, Yeah. But there are reasons to think that microbial life might not be all that rare in the universe, but that complex life and sort of brain-centered life could be very rare, because you need planets to not just be able to start life, but to be able to sustain it. we animals need a lot of oxygen, and there's some very special things about our planet that make that possible. Not just photosynthesis, but the activity of plate tectonics and so on. This is a really special place. So so for microbiologists, it's going to be really exciting, and I think the rest of us have to come to appreciate just how lovely things like slime molds and various microbes are, because that's probably what's in our future when we go to Mars.
I think that's a really, really good attitude. And I think the idea that we need, and your book really did help me appreciate slime molds. I can say that. So,
slime molds are awesome.
Yes, I mean, fascinating. I love these questions. Okay. Oh, this is such a good question that I love so much. What are the most interesting superstitions or cultural ideas that have manifested from the undefined gray area between life and non-life? Have you found anything like that? Is there anything that stands out?
Well, in the book, I mean, I talk about these different kinds of lines that we draw around life, and we've been talking a lot about, well, is this species alive or not? But each of us has lines drawn around our own lives, its beginning and its end. And these can be either clear or fuzzy and contested, or are really almost a matter of how we define our own concepts. So, with the beginning of life, obviously that's hugely controversial these days, because in the United States, there are people who will claim that life begins at conception. And I argue, no, it doesn't. It just, no matter what sort of approach you take to life, that cannot be the case. But what's interesting is that, like really when people are talking about life, the beginning of life, they're talking about the beginning of a human life. And that, again, is way more complex than simply, life or not life. And there's one culture in West Africa where they have this amazing view of pregnancy and birth, where they look at babies as newborn babies as visitors from the land of the dead. So they come from this land where their ancestors have gone back to, and these are visitors. And sometimes they're only there for a very brief time, but if they stay longer, then they are really considered part of this world. I think that's a very powerful way of thinking about that liminal time when new people are developing, both in the womb and without. It's an area that I honestly, like, I feel like I have a lot more to learn, but certainly in the work that I did on this book, that those are some of the interesting things that I learned.
Yes, fascinating. And while we are in the deep end of the just most controversial of philosophical questions, what do you believe happens after we die? Is a question in the chat.
Well, I haven't been there, so I can't tell you for sure. But certainly, if we look at if we understand the biology, insofar as we do of ourselves, our brains, and so on, I think when we die, what we identify as ourselves no longer exists. It's sort of like saying, well, what happened to you before you were born or conceived? Like, did you exist then? I mean, if you did, what was it like then? You probably don't remember. So I guess that's how I would view it. I mean, I mean, here again, I'm talking specifically about life as science reveals it to us. And it's fair enough for people to say, like, well, there are other ways of thinking and learning about life, and I will accept that. But that's the focus of this book. So if you're asking me, I'm going to answer in those terms.
Yeah, I in the same way. But I mean, this kind of question, like this kind of discussion, whoever put that question there, like I love these deep philosophical questions and how they relate to this big topic. And so,
I mean, these are questions that kids, when you have kids, like they'll ask you when they're 5 and you're like, oh, I got to be the parent who knows everything, but I don't know the answer to this. Like, these are the questions we ask from childhood, and as adults, it's totally legitimate to keep asking them and get for answers.
Absolutely. I have a 4-year-old, and so we're definitely in that world. And
you're in that zone.
And you know what? The tolerance for ambiguity is such an important thing. And sometimes we say, I don't know. And I think that that's a legitimate answer too, depending on the question. But yet, I think that, these questions, we ask them when we're children because they are the most interesting things. I mean, they are the deepest questions. In that vein, we have one more. I think that's the last. I think it's just the last one in the chat that we have not hit yet, which is sort of related on the same subject and also sort of feels like the things that you wonder from early on. But also I do think connects to some of the art and literature that you mentioned in the book, which is, why do you think people are afraid of ghosts?
Wow, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Why are we afraid of ghosts? That's interesting, because I think, well, I guess I would classify ghosts with zombies, which I was talking about before. So ghosts are, we think of ghosts as being entities that have some of the qualities of life, so sometimes they have a shape, they can communicate, they can move around, they can do things, they can, and yet they're not alive fully. And so that's, for us, is frightening. And maybe it's frightening because, we kind of know like what living things can and can't do. And that can be scary enough if, obviously if someone attacks you, that's very frightening. But if you imagine something that has some of the qualities of life, but is not limited in other ways by life's limits, that can be very disorienting, because they could be capable of anything. And that's interesting. Once you start to think about these things, you not only think about, the thing itself, like the ghost, but you think about like, what are your own emotions and how do you recognize this, and how do you think of this as alive or not alive? I mean, in a way, like, this is a book, it's a book about chemistry and astrobiology and so on, but it's also a book about psychology.
Yeah.
Because again, like we come to the question of what is life, in a sense, already feeling like we know. And then we just fall into all these situations where our intuitions don't help us or leave us terrified of ghosts.
Right. Well, on that fascinating note, I will leave you. Thank you so much, Carl, for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone watching and everyone asking questions. And there is information, I believe, in the banner beneath me about where you can get this wonderful book. I recommend it.